Something extraordinary is happening on the battlefields of eastern Ukraine right now. Something that military analysts, war historians, and even Russia's own internal pollsters are no longer able to ignore or explain away. The largest land army in Europe is dying in real time. Not metaphorically, not rhetorically, mathematically. Over 1,300,000 casualties. That number is not from a Ukrainian propaganda office. It is not from a Western think tank with an agenda. That figure comes from Dutch military intelligence, from the Estonian Foreign Intelligence Service, from Britain's Ministry of Defense, from former CIA Director William Burns, and from Wall Street Journal reporting based on US government sources. All of them arriving independently at the same catastrophic conclusion. Putin's military machine has consumed itself, and what is happening right now in the spring of 2026 is not a pause in that consumption. It is an acceleration. In March alone, the Russian army lost 35,351 troops. Killed and wounded in 1 month, a new record, breaking the previous record set in December 2025, which itself broke the record before that. Records are being broken, but not the kind Putin wanted. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. For the first time since this war began in February 2022, the number of Russian soldiers being killed and wounded each month now exceeds the number of new recruits signing up to replace them. The Institute for the Study of War confirmed it without ambiguity. Russia's casualty rate surpassed its recruitment rate in January 2026. After years of maintaining the replacement pipeline, the pipeline has cracked. The army is losing more men than it can find. But stay with us, because that is not even the worst part of what we are about to show you. There's a calculation being made right now inside the Kremlin, a calculation that Russian military planners have known about for months and have been desperately trying to solve with every tool available to them. The calculation is simple. Ukraine's stated military target for 2026 is to kill or seriously wound 50,000 Russian soldiers per month. Russia's current recruitment is running at roughly 25,000 to 30,000 new soldiers per month. If Ukraine achieves its target and Russia cannot significantly increase its recruitment, the deployed Russian force in Ukraine does not just stop growing. It begins to shrink. Active combat regiments run below strength. Reserve formations are drawn forward prematurely. The front line thins, and thin front lines, in a war where drones can see everything, break. This is not a theory about the distant future. This is the arithmetic of right now. And the data from the first quarter of 2026 shows that Ukraine is moving toward that target while Russia is moving away from the numbers it needs. That is the strategic situation as of this week. Now let us go through it, section by section, because each layer of this story is more unsettling than the last. Let us start with the full weight of the numbers, because they tell a story that no amount of state television can overwrite. Over 4 years of full-scale war, Russia has suffered what Netherlands Military Intelligence and Security Service estimated in April 2026 as more than 500,000 dead and 1.2 million total permanent losses. Permanent meaning killed, severely wounded, missing, or captured. Men who are not coming back to the front, men who are not coming home whole. To put that in historical context, the Soviet Union lost approximately 800,000 soldiers across its entire 10-year war in Afghanistan. Russia has now surpassed that figure in 4 years, fighting a country it publicly called a brotherly nation. Every single day, Russian families receive the news that someone is not coming back. In the first quarter of 2026 alone, regional governments across 17 Russian regions where data is publicly available paid death compensation to the families of 5,600 fallen soldiers. Extrapolated across the entire country, that is approximately 25,000 families per quarter receiving formal notification that their son, father, husband, or brother is gone. Not injured, not missing, gone. And the territory Russia has purchased with that blood? Over the past 12 months, Russia captured an average of 160 square miles per month. Across Ukraine, which covers over 233,000 square miles, that represents less than 1% of the country's total land area. Less than 1%. Purchased with over 400,000 casualties in a single year. But even that pace is collapsing. Because in April 2026, something happened that stunned military analysts tracking this conflict closely. For the first time in 27 consecutive months, Russia suffered a net loss of territory. Not a stall, not a slowdown, a reversal. Russian forces fell back. The army that was supposed to take Kiev in 3 days began in the spring of 2026 to lose ground it had previously taken. Russia Matters, a project of Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center, quantified what they described as the sputtering Russian offensive. Using data from the Institute for the Study of War, they found that in the month ending April 28th, Russian forces suffered a net loss of 67 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. Retired Australian Army General Mick Ryan, a professional soldier with no political interest in the outcome, said it with clinical precision. With large-scale deep strikes on his territory and a ground campaign not generating tempo, 2026 may be the worst year yet for Putin. The worst year yet. For a man who started this war with the intention of ending it in 72 hours. But to understand why this army is dying, you need to understand what weapon is killing it. And the answer is something that did not exist in meaningful military capacity anywhere on Earth 4 years ago, and certainly not in Ukraine. Drones. Ukraine has constructed what is now arguably the most sophisticated unmanned warfare capability on the planet, built from scratch, built by a country whose entire military budget before this war was smaller than the annual operating cost of a single American aircraft carrier. In 2025, Ukraine's drone forces conducted over 819,000 confirmed successful strikes on Russian targets, every single one verified by drone video, not estimated, not projected, verified. In December 2025 alone, Ukrainian drones struck 106,859 separate targets. In March 2026, Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov announced that Ukrainian drones struck 151,207 targets in a single month, a 50% increase over February. In March 2026, drones were responsible for 96% of all Russian casualties. 96. Artillery and small arms accounted for the remaining 4%. The Russian soldier of 2026 is not dying to a bullet or a shell in most engagements. He is dying to a small, quiet, often inexpensive unmanned aircraft that he frequently never hears before it reaches him. Ukraine is currently producing drones at a rate of 4 million aircraft per year, with plans already underway to reach 7 million in 2026. Around 500 Ukrainian companies manufacture drones. Approximately 95% of all drones used in combat are domestically produced. Ukraine's stated military target for 2026 is to inflict 50,000 to 60,000 Russian casualties per month through drone operations alone. That target is no longer a wish. In the first quarter of 2026, Ukraine came within striking distance of it, and they are expanding the battlefield in ways Russia had never anticipated. In April 2026, Ukraine launched 450 successful strikes against targets inside Russia and occupied territories. Oil refineries struck from over 1,000 kilometers away. Military facilities deep inside Russian territory hit by drones flying beyond the range most analysts thought possible a year ago. By October 2025, Ukrainian drone strikes had already forced nearly 40% of Russia's oil refining capacity offline. These are not theatrical strikes. These are economic strikes. Every refinery that goes dark reduces Russia's fuel supply. Every logistics hub hit disrupts the supply chain feeding Russian regiments at the front. Ukraine is not just fighting a land battle. It is dismantling the infrastructure of the Russian war machine from the inside. And something happened in April of 2026 that no military historian has a precedent for. Ukrainian land robots and drones, operating together without a single human physically present at the scene, accepted the surrender of Russian soldiers and took them prisoner. The human operator sat miles away at a screen while the machines did the work. The first time in the recorded history of warfare that enemy combatants were taken prisoner by unmanned systems with no human soldier at the scene. This is the battlefield of 2026, and Russia's military was built for a battlefield that stopped existing years ago. This is where the story takes a turn that reveals something even darker about the state of this army. Because Russia is not, on paper, running out of men. Russia has a population of 144 million people, one of the largest theoretical manpower reservoirs on Earth. What Russia is running out of is willing men. In the first quarter of 2026, recruitment into the Russian armed forces fell by 20% compared to the same period in 2025. 20% in one quarter. The Kremlin had set a target of recruiting between 1,100 and 1,150 new soldiers per day this year. The actual figure in early 2026 dropped to around 800 per day. In some weeks, as low as 800. The gap sounds manageable until the arithmetic is applied honestly. Russia is currently losing between 1,000 and 1,500 men per day to death and serious wounds. It is replacing them at 800 per day. The force grouping in Ukraine is not growing. It is not even holding steady. It is shrinking. So what does a government do when it needs soldiers and cannot find them voluntarily? It improvises. And the improvisation currently being employed by Russian regional authorities reveals the depth of this crisis in ways that should be impossible to look away from. Universities across Russia have been formally instructed that at least 2% of their student body must sign military contracts. This is not a suggestion. The Russian Ministry of Education issued the directive. Students at institutions of higher learning being assigned recruitment quotas as though military service were a graduation requirement. Regional and municipal executive authorities have been instructed by Moscow to compile lists of potential recruits from among residents who have outstanding debts for housing and utility services, people who cannot pay their water bill, People who are behind on rent add their names to the volunteer list, offer to resolve their debt problem with a signature, send them east. 40% of all new Russian military personnel are now being drawn from what Ukrainian military analysts describe as vulnerable population groups. Prisoners offered early release and amnesty. People in serious financial distress offered debt relief. Foreign nationals from Central Asian countries who were in Russia for work and found themselves confronted with signing choices they were not in a position to refuse. Rights groups report coercion being applied to conscripts and serving soldiers to sign indefinite combat contracts. But the most documented and disturbing method of all came to light through reporting by RFERL's regional service. A 36-year-old father of 4 from the northern Russian city of Petrozavodsk, a man named Yegor Sabinich, sobered up after a night of drinking with friends and found himself not, as he had naturally assumed, in a detox center. He was in a military enlistment office. He had been detained by police while intoxicated and, while in that state, unknowingly signed a binding military contract binding him to service. A relative told the reporters plainly. He was deceived. He had no idea what he was signing. Russian human rights groups say such cases are becoming more frequent. Intoxicated men steered toward signature lines. The Institute for the Study of War confirmed the broader pattern, noting that Russia is increasingly facing systemic problems in replenishing personnel. Drunk men signing contracts they do not understand. Students receiving recruitment quotas, debtors added to volunteer lists. This is the army of a military superpower in the 5th year of a war. It started with the intention of winning before the week was over. And the geographic distribution of who is dying to sustain this war deserves its own examination because it reveals a political calculus that is increasingly difficult for Moscow to maintain. The Kremlin has spent 4 years working to insulate its 2 major metropolitan centers, Moscow and St. Petersburg, from the visible human cost of this conflict. The understanding was simple. The cities are politically sensitive. The cities have educated populations with access to information and social networks. The cities are where protests begin, so the war's burden was pushed outward. To the provinces, to the ethnic republics, to the regions that have the least political power and the most economic desperation. Tuva, Buryatia, the Chukotka Autonomous District in Russia's Far East. Indigenous populations numbering as few as 15,000 people suffering per capita death rates that would constitute a genuine demographic emergency in any other context. One researcher studying this pattern said something that should be quoted precisely. Supplying cannon fodder for the war is now considered the main indicator of political effectiveness for Russian regional governors. That is the measure of effectiveness for a regional political leader in Russia today. Not economic development, not healthcare outcomes. experiment of arming criminals, sending them to a brutal war, and then releasing them back into Russian society is producing entirely predictable results. This is the interior landscape of Russia in 2026, not the Victory Day parade version. Not the state television version, the version where regional governors compete to prove their loyalty to Moscow by delivering enough bodies to a war that is consuming those bodies faster than any system can replace them. And that brings us to the most significant development of all, what the Russian people themselves now say when they think no one from the state is listening. For most of 4 years, official polling told a story of stable, unwavering public support. State television told Russians they were winning. The data told Russians they were prevailing. The system told Russians that sacrifice was producing results. But in the final months of 2025, state-run polling, not dissident platforms, not Western sources, began showing something different. The leading Russian public opinion research center, VTSIOM, published its annual end-of-year survey. 55% of Russians said they expected the war to end in 2026. 70% called 2026 a more successful year ahead than 2025. On its surface, this sounds like optimism, but read it again carefully. A majority of Russians, according to the state's own pollster, are hoping for the war to end, not hoping for decisive victory, not hoping for the conquest of Kyiv, hoping for it to stop. The aspiration has shifted. The public no longer speaks publicly of winning, they speak of ending. And independent polling, conducted under conditions of significant risk by researchers working through non-state channels, goes considerably further. 2/3 of Russians, the highest proportion since the war began, now say they support peace negotiations. 2 out of every 3. In a country where expressing anti-war sentiment carries the legal risk of criminal prosecution, where simply speaking the wrong words in the wrong place can lead to years in prison. Even through that filter of fear, 2/3 are willing to say they want the war to stop. Washington Post, reporting from April 2026, citing journalists and analysts monitoring Russian society, described a mood turning bleak, Putin's approval ratings falling, citizens voicing despair, rising discontent visible across Russian society as the war enters its 5th year. The economy struggles under sanctions, and the public grows frustrated with internet restrictions and information blackouts. The Public Sociology Laboratory, a group that places researchers incognito in Russian provincial towns to observe actual social behavior rather than stated opinion, found little to no evidence of a genuine rally around the flag effect. What they found instead was the old Soviet coping mechanism reactivated: internal emigration, living a private life while performing the minimal public loyalty required for safety, keeping the head down, not speaking about the war at work, not discussing it with neighbors, retreating into silence as the safest available space. This is not apathy. It is the psychological adaptation of people living in the late stage of a conflict they cannot safely oppose, but have quietly stopped believing in. There's a scenario that military and political analysts now openly discuss in which this situation produces a moment of elite fracture inside the Russian system, not a revolution from the streets. Russia's history does not produce street revolutions that succeed against organized state power. What Russia's history does produce, at intervals, is internal realignment among the people who run the system. The Wagner Group march on Moscow in June 2023, when Yevgeny Prigozhin led armed columns toward the Russian capital and faced minimal organized military resistance before standing down, was not just a dramatic episode. It was a data point. It showed that significant elements of the Russian military establishment either could not or chose not to intercept an armed column marching on the capital. Prigozhin reached the outskirts of Moscow. His men were not stopped. He turned back by choice, not by force. That is the architecture of a system under stress, not broken, not near immediate collapse, but visibly under strain in the places where only insiders can see. By the time Russia reaches the summer of 2026, the cumulative pressure of the military, economic, demographic, and social forces described in this analysis will be operating simultaneously, losses running at over 1,000 per day with recruitment falling. An oil sector losing 40% of its refining capacity to drone strikes, regional budgets being consumed by death payments, a public majority quietly hoping it ends, an elite that watched a private military army march on the capital 3 years ago without being stopped. None of this determines the outcome. None of this predicts the timeline. What it does is describe the contours of a state under stresses that compound each other, and that do not resolve themselves simply by continuing the war. So we return to the question that every honest analysis of this conflict must eventually confront. What does a nuclear-armed state do when its army is losing more men than it can recruit? When its own public has stopped believing in victory? When its economic infrastructure is being degraded from the air? When its elite watched an armed private militia march on the capital and did nothing? When the regional governors who supply the cannon fodder are running out of money to pay for it? The range of answers to that question spans from negotiated settlement to catastrophic escalation. And the unsettling truth is that both ends of that range remain genuinely possible. Here is what a negotiated settlement looks like from where we stand. Russia retains control of some of the Ukrainian territory it currently occupies. Ukraine receives security guarantees and eventually a path toward European integration. The killing stops. The bleeding stops. The arithmetic stops, demanding its daily payment in lives. The possibility exists. The diplomatic channels are open, however fractiously. And a majority of Russians, as we have established, now privately want exactly this outcome. But here is what catastrophic escalation looks like from where we stand. A leadership that has publicly staked its legitimacy and its historical legacy on this war, that has imprisoned its opponents, that has renamed its spy academy after the founder of state terror, that has criminalized the act of calling the war a war, may find it psychologically and institutionally impossible to accept an outcome that looks like defeat. Leaders who cannot lose without losing themselves do not choose to lose. They choose to escalate, to raise the stakes high enough that the other side flinches first, to make the cost of continuing too high for everyone. Russia has nuclear weapons. It has said so repeatedly in the context of this conflict. The threat has been implicit and at times explicit. And a state that is losing, that is bleeding, that is watching its public mood shift toward war weariness, that is watching its army consume itself faster than it can be rebuilt, is also a state in which the pressure to do something dramatic, something that changes the terms of the confrontation entirely, grows with every passing month. This is not a prediction. It is a description of the pressure gradients inside a system that is under stress at every level simultaneously. What is not possible, what the data has now definitively closed off as an option, is simply continuing as though nothing is changing. 1,300,000 casualties, 35,000 dead and wounded in 1 month. Recruitment down 20%, while losses hit record highs. Drones destroying 96% of Russian troops struck on the battlefield. Ground robots taking prisoners. Students assigned military quotas. Drunk men signing contracts they cannot remember. An army that was going to take a country in 72 hours, now in year 5. Having consumed itself against a smaller, poorer, less populous neighbor that built its war machine out of innovation while Russia tried to win with mass, the deathbed image is not melodrama, it is arithmetic. And somewhere in the frozen ground of eastern Ukraine, where the numbers are updated every 24 hours and the drones never stop flying, the arithmetic continues its patient, relentless work. The question was never whether Putin's army could be bled to this point. The question now is, what happens to everything built around it when the bleeding finally stops? And that answer, when it comes, will reshape the world.